translates key al-Qaeda documents, some previously unavailable in English, that provide a window into the thinking of radical Islam's leadership. The Al-Qaeda Reader, divided into theology and propaganda, focuses on the writings of Ayman al-Zawahiri and Osama bin Laden. Raymond Ibrahim is interviewed by Lawrence Wright, winner of the 2007 Pulitzer Prize in General Nonfiction, for his book The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11.
Raymond, congratulations on the publication of your new book, The Al-Qaeda Reader by Doubleday, just now out. Tell me a little bit about your background and how you came to write this book.
Sure. Well, it kind of all starts actually with 9/11, ironically. When 9/11 occurred, I was living in California and I was attending Fresno State University, and I had just started my master's thesis, which ironically dealt with what's called the Battle of Yarmouk, which was one of the very first battles between the growing Islamic power, about 4 years after Muhammad died, and Christendom, the Byzantines. And so when the 9/11 attacks happened, even though I was mostly immersed in historical and theological studies regarding Islam and Christianity, and I hadn't been paying too much attention to contemporary affairs, I really didn't know, like most people, who Al-Qaeda was prior to that. But I started reading some of their communiques on the internet and some of their statements, and I became very amazed to find the sort of continuity that existed between Al-Qaeda and what I was studying, which was the Battle of Yarmouk, which was 1,400 years before 9/11. For example, even though no one in the West will really know about that battle, you'll find Al-Qaeda in the book, for example. He often quotes it as an example, you know, as some sort of role model for the Mujahideen. So anyway, at that point, I really got fascinated with the whole radical Islam movement, and I decided to further my education by focusing specifically in that. I was focusing mostly on the early historical aspects, like the Crusades also. So I applied to Georgetown University, the Center of Contemporary Arab Studies, and I went there, and that's what brought me out to DC. And then after one semester, I got an internship at the Library of Congress at the Near East section, which is also very conducive to what I was trying to research. And I went there, and eventually I had to drop out of Georgetown due to the full-time job. And so while I was there, I still had an interest in Al-Qaeda, and I would still always look on the internet and read about their statements and their communiques and their interviews. And I had a pretty good picture of what their grievances were, which I think a lot of us do. And their grievances range from things like, the main one, of course, is Western support for Israel, the deaths of children due to UN sanctions in Iraq, everything, and then of course later, and at the time, of course, one of the big ones was that the U.S. forces were based in Saudi Arabia, and the list went on, and then when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan after 9/11, that also became a grievance, and Iraq is a grievance. So then, in the course of my duties at work, where at the Near East section, where we get so many books from the Arab world, all written in Arabic, it's my habit to just peruse through books, especially when they'd have a picture of Osama bin Laden or a picture of the Statue of Liberty with a sword and blood coming out of its mouth. And I would look at these, and I started coming across various excerpts, and then I found essays and entire treatises written by Osama bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri, which subsequently I found had never been translated or disseminated. And I started reading these, and what struck me immediately was how different in both tone and content these were. Now there was no talk about grievances and reciprocal treatment. We're attacking you because you attacked us. These were theological treatises. They don't have to do with the temporal. They have to do with what God wants Muslims to do. And so when I started reading these, I found it started rendering moot all their grievances. And the reason I say that is because, for example, their propaganda culminates with them, like I said, saying all we're doing, including 9/11, is retaliation to the U.S.'s aggression. Exactly. So, for example, here's a quote from Osama bin Laden. He says, when he was addressing the Americans a couple years ago, he said, "In conclusion, I say to the American people, we will continue to fight you and continue to conduct martyrdom operations, suicide bombings, inside and outside America until you depart from your oppressive course, abandon your follies and rein in your fools." So you can see he says, until you do these things, which, if they're true, then it's plausible. One can understand his grievance.
You often hear him saying that, we are making offers,
exactly.
recently
he's
in
reaching out.
in his most recent videotape, for
Yeah.
instance. And in 2004, when he offered a truce
Exactly.
to the
Exactly.
Europeans, it's on you.
He portrays himself basically like you're saying, the ball's in
Yeah.
your court.
Right.
Once you cease the hostilities, we will too. And then a very common statement that he always makes in his messages goes as follows: reciprocal treatment is part of justice. He who initiates the aggression is the unjust one. And he's of course implying that it's the U.S.
Right.
and West. And then these texts that I came across, and eventually I included 4 treatises that make up the theology section, which is well more than half of the book. The first one, which was written by Osama bin Laden, is called Moderate Islam's A Prostration to the West. That one just completely, totally renders moot all of his grievances. And the reason is because it was addressed specifically to Muslims, to the Muslims in Saudi Arabia, the Wahhabis.
Right.
And it was never meant for Western eyes, and that's why we haven't seen it, even though it was written right around 2002.
Really?
Yeah.
What, it was a written communique or a tape or
Right.
something?
Well, it has an interesting history, actually. Basically, some time ago, he says about, in the book, he says approximately 60 American crusaders and priests and intellectuals, those are his words, drafted a letter, a very stern letter, in his words, saying why, and it's titled What We Are Fighting For.
I remember that.
Yeah. I don't know if it's from the American Foundation of, it's in the endnotes, I can
Yeah.
pull it up later, but, so they wrote this letter and they directed it to the Muslim world, and then about 100 Saudi clerics, very authoritative clerics, wrote back a letter called How We Can Coexist. And this letter, if you read it, it's basically, it captures the moderate Islamic voice.
Right.
Okay, so it sounds like you're talking to a moderate Muslim, and they talk about things like, we want to live with equality, we want to treat each other justly, we want to live, live and let live. And then Osama bin Laden got irate and wrote a letter to those Muslims called Moderate Islam is a Prostration to the West. And he completely tears into them, and what makes it important though is that his attack is very much theologically grounded.
Right.
He gives the sources that render their arguments false. For example, when those moderates had written in their statement to the Americans, they talked about how we want to live, like I said, in peace, and we want to get along. And then he wrote to them and he says, this is him talking, Osama, what evidence is there for Muslims to pursue this dialogue and shared understanding? Because they were also saying dialogue and shared understandings are very important between us, Muslims and non-Muslims. What did the Prophet, the companions after him, and the righteous forebears do? Did they wage jihad against the infidels, attacking them all over the earth in order to place them under the suzerainty of Islam in great humility and submission? Or did they send messages to discover shared understandings, he's being sarcastic, between themselves and the infidels in order that they may reach an understanding whereby universal peace, security, and natural relations would spread in such a satanic manner as this? Now what's ironic is he puts down universal peace, security, and natural relations that the moderates and that the Americans would be talking about, that sort of thing. But when he himself communicates with the West, he always talks about the Western standard of peace and security and natural relations. So you can see there's a contradiction, a little hypocrisy going on here.
Well, Raymond, in your examination of all these documents, have you noticed an evolution in Al-Qaeda's thinking? It seems to me that when Al-Qaeda really began to be formed, going up during the whole period of the American buildup in Saudi Arabia to counter Saddam Hussein and so on, he had stated political goals. Expel the infidels from the Arabian Peninsula. And he more or less accomplished those goals in March of 2003 when the Bush administration announced that they were going to withdraw their forces from Saudi Arabia because Saddam Hussein was overthrown and the no-fly zone no longer had to be enforced. The very next month, Al-Qaeda began its assault on Western housing compounds. And you saw a similar situation in Madrid where the Al-Qaeda cell there had succeeded in overturning the Spanish government after the Madrid train bombings, and yet then tried to go on and create even greater damage after achieving their goals.
That's exactly it. And that's why these messages, and that's why when people call them propaganda, that's exactly what they are. when Al-Qaeda states it has a grievance because of Israel, okay, and a lot of Muslims would agree with it, a lot of non-Muslims would agree with it, does it mean that once Israel disappears, that that's going to bring peace between a group like Al-Qaeda and radicals and the West? He would imply yes, but these writings show otherwise. And going back to what you were saying, you're right. You know, for his original big complaint, and he wrote a fatwa in 1996 about it, was basically U.S. forces in the peninsula.
Right.
But then that ended, and he came up with new ones. And if you'll see in the book, his complaints range from, like I said, the usual Israel and stuff like that, to something you would never expect from him. For example, he complains about the U.S. for not signing the Qeada Protocol.
I know, he's
for
such
the
an
environment.
environmentalist.
Yeah, exactly. He tells the U.S. how it abuses and exploits their women. And whether there's some truth in that or not, it's amazing coming from his worldview of women.
I'm constantly surprised by these, these stances he takes about American politics.
Right.
But his own politics are so obscure. You can, the Harmony documents, which American and coalition troops captured after the Tora Bora raids and so on in 2001, thousands and thousands of pages. One of my sources said that they were soaked in kerosene, but the guy that was in charge of destroying them ran away before he lit the match. But, they have the Al-Qaeda constitution and their employment contract, many, many pages of military manuals and so on, but not a single page of politics, their stances on different political things that are essential to understanding any political movement, which leads me to think that it's not really a political movement at all, because we don't even know what kind of economic model he follows. Is he a Marxist or a Keynesian? Do you see any...
I see exactly what you're saying, but see, that's what you're doing there, and what I would do, and what a lot of people are doing, is we're applying kind of a Western epistemology on how to handle these problems. But with him, it's one simple word: Sharia law. Sharia law, which has been articulated and fixed over the course of 1,400 years, has an answer for everything.
But his own country has Sharia law. What's his complaint?
Well, but the monarchy, by letting those infidels come and live around the holy temples, prove that they're obviously infidels, because Muhammad said you have to expel Christians and Jews from the peninsula, and there shall not be two religions on their homeland and stuff like that.
That's what he said allegedly on his deathbed.
Yeah,
but at that time, there were Christians and Jews all over the region.
But Omar did expel them.
Yes, he did.
And he's a righteous caliph.
Yes, he's
For
one of the four.
other things.
You mentioned Israel. How important is Israel to the theology of Al-Qaeda? How central is it?
Well, there's two ways to look at Israel. There's the way that we would understand, which is basic, and what a lot of Muslims would agree with, which is that Israel, according to the Muslim worldview, is an oppressive entity, and it's usurped Palestinian land, and it's oppressing them. Now that, I believe, in and of itself can be addressed and can be handled, and I'm personally not saying either or, which is right or wrong. That's, I believe, an issue that should be addressed. But the problem is then, when you find through these writings that the Jews are condemned, and damned if they do, damned if they don't. So in other words, even if Israel ceased to exist, based solely on theology, the Jews are still enemies. They have to always be attacked until they are dhimmis, second-class citizens under the Islamic scheme of things. And so that's the point. One kind of one outdoes the other. One is temporal, which is talking about Israel as in the now. But the other transcends time and space, and it makes it more important because it has nothing to do with circumstances. It's a fixed commandment from God, the way it's understood by Muslims. When the verses say, for example, verse 929, which is a very famous verse, and it's said to have abrogated so many of the more peaceful and tolerant verses, basically says, fight those people from among the book, people of the book, the Jews and Christians, who do not believe in Allah and who do not believe in his prophet, and who do not uphold Allah's laws and forbid what Allah has forbidden and what his prophet has forbidden. In other words, who don't follow Sharia law, and who do not practice the true religion until they pay the jizya, tribute, with willing submission and feel themselves utterly subdued. Now look at the word, until. It didn't say until they stop attacking you. It didn't say until Israel ceases to be. It says until they pay tribute and live under your suzerainty in submission. So to many Muslims, that right there, that's fixed on high. That's not something that can just be pushed aside. And that's the problem. See, if Israel really is at fault, and let's say it is guilty, in my opinion, based on the theology, which is always hostile.
Right.
You know, why should it not be that way? Because it's already an enemy, no matter what it does. It's already condemned. So why would you expect, and not just Israel, the West in general, the whole world, the non-Muslim world, why should you give in to any concessions, even if they are legitimate, if you're also told at the same time you are our enemies no matter what, until you give in to one of the three choices: become a Muslim, live under our authority, or fight to the death. And that is a very well codified worldview in Islamic law, in Sharia law. That's not something that's open to debate or interpretation.
Right.
Perhaps you've heard of it, the abode of Islam,
Yes.
and the abode of war, which are always fighting perpetually.
But there is a middle ground.
Yeah, there's some jurists, not all, say there's the abode of treaties.
Right. And bin Laden has spoken of this
Right.
in his offer to Europe, for instance.
Yeah, he's offered treaties, but under Islamic law, these treaties don't abrogate the concept that the two must always fight. In other words, you can have a treaty with infidels or non-Muslims. Under Islamic law, it shouldn't exceed 10 years. And you only do that when you yourself are in an extremely weakened position. So if anything, when he did offer those treaties, that was a very telling sign that Al-Qaeda was waning in power, because why would it make peace with infidels if it's as strong as it likes to claim?
Now you concentrate on the writings and speeches of two men, Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number two man in Al-Qaeda, and in many respects the chief propagandist, the brains behind the organization.
Exactly.
What do you, even analyzing their writings, how do they divide up the duties? What is bin Laden's job, and what is Zawahiri's job?
From what I've seen, bin Laden's job, they're both propagandists. I mean, we see their videos come out, and Zawahiri, I think last year he came out with like 15 videos.
24.
24.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
back to back.
Yeah.
So he has a lot of time doing this stuff. So they both engage in the propaganda. I think though that bin Laden is much more the symbolic kind of future caliph, and he's the charismatic leader. He's well composed. He has his long beard, which is black now.
Right.
And he's also the money man. And he's the Saudi, or he's an Arabian, so he's actually related to the Prophet in that sense. He's from the peninsula, whereas Zawahiri's Egyptian. But Zawahiri, and what you'll see in here, he's the man who actually, like you said, he's the ideologue. He's the one that puts together the treatises, the fatwas, and he combines them. So there's 3 documents here, for example: Loyalty and Enmity, which is about 70 pages, and this is compiled, written by Ayman Zawahiri. The reason I say compiled, because more than half of it are just the statements from the Quran and from the Hadith and from the most authoritative Islamic theologians. And he's also written showing how democracy and Sharia law are antithetical, and it's a total condemnation of democracy and how it can never work with Islam. And the troubling thing about these, though, is, like I said, when you read them, it's not even their words. See, the propaganda, it's their words. When you read the theology, some of it is their words, but it's all based on the words of the Quran, which are clear-cut. They're not. Some things in the Quran are ambiguous, but some things aren't. Like that verse I quoted, 929. It just says, fight them until they live under submission.
Right.
So, now, for example, the loyalty and enmity, that one is dedicated to showing how Muslims must at all times maintain loyalty to fellow Muslims, even if they're cruel to them, and how at all times they must maintain enmity and hatred and disavowal towards non-Muslims. Did I say at first that they're supposed to have loyalty to non-Muslims? Loyalty to Muslims.
Yeah.
Okay. Loyalty to Muslims and enmity and disavowal to non-Muslims. Okay. And it's a very long treatise. It's about 70 pages. But when you look at it, for example, I'll quote just the heart of it circulates around several Quranic verses. For example, these are all Quranic verses. O you who have believed, do not take the Jews and the Christians for friends. They are but friends of each other. And whoever amongst you takes them for a friend, then surely he is one of them. In other words, he's an apostate. Or, this is another verse, you shall find none who believe in Allah in the last day, in other words, a Muslim, on friendly terms with those who oppose Allah and his messenger. And oppose doesn't mean like attack them. Oppose means reject him, not submit to him. Even if they be their fathers, their sons, their brothers, or their nearest kindred. Another verse, neither the Jews nor the Christians will ever approve of you until you follow their ways. Again, until apostatized.
Right.
So these verses form the centerpiece of this loyalty and enmity doctrine, and that's the problem. How can you then say, look, this is all Al-Qaeda's propaganda?
Well, but all religions have problematic texts. You know, in Christianity, for instance,
Right.
you know, we're supposed to stone homosexuals, or
Well, it's the Old
even
Testament.
kill your disobedient
Right.
children, and
You're
we
right.
have chosen to draw a circle around
Right.
this. Now, Islam has a problem, I think, not so much with the religion as with fundamentalism, which is a problem with a lot of different religions.
But what does that mean, fundamentalism?
Taking selectively certain passages in the sacred text and justifying present-day actions.
Right.
I would say that's the basis of the problem of
Right.
fundamentalism in any religion.
Okay.
And in this case, in Islam, I think we've got Al-Qaeda is very selective. You must have run across the question of martyrdom, for instance. In the Quran, the Prophet says, "Do not kill yourselves."
Well, he says don't destroy yourself, but I'd like to go back to the religious issue.
Okay,
if
go
I
ahead.
may. Okay. The thing about the religious issue and Christianity and Judaism, of course. Now let's look at. I would argue the New Testament, Christianity proper, doesn't advocate any kind of violence. Just the New Testament in and of itself. Turn the other cheek, pray for those who persecute you. Christianity, in that sense, is very metaphysical and passive.
You could say then
Right.
that the New Testament supersedes
Right,
the Old Testament.
right. Now, the Old Testament is a good case in point. You can read about, for example, Joshua entering the land of Canaan, being commanded by God to kill every man, woman, child, and all the cattle and every walking thing that lives, right? Pretty violent stuff. And you would think, ostensibly, how's that different from what's in the Quran? It is different, and the way it's different is because if you look in the Old Testament, and there is a lot of violence, let's just look at that one, the genocide issue with Joshua. In the Bible, when you read it, God commands Joshua to go and kill the Jebusites, the Hebusites, the Canaanites, and he says, until you get that piece of land. So it was, when you really read it, it's more of a historical thing. It's not an open-ended commandment to all the Jews or Hebrews and then subsequently the Jews. It didn't say kill the Gentiles until you take over the world or something like that. It was rooted in a specific time and place and directed at a specific people. Now we can judge that any way we want, say that's unethical of God and this and that, but it never became codified into Hebrew law. It never became some sort of worldview where now Hebrews go and kill Gentiles left and right. Now whether Jews do that is, again, that maybe they do, but it's not part of their law. On the other hand, in Islam, those verses, 929 for example, and verse 9:5, which is a very famous verse, is called the sword verse. That one also runs as follows: slay the idolaters wherever you find them.
Right.
Kill them, besiege them, until basically they submit to Islam. Now the early jurists of Islam, they realized that, okay, we have these violent verses, but we also have pretty tolerant verses.
Right.
Muhammad said, you have your religion, I have mine.
Right.
Right? He said there's no coercion in religion.
Exactly.
Okay? So now the jurists needed to derive laws, because Islam, a big component of it is living under the law, the Sharia, and it's derived from the Quran and the Sunnah. So how can they derive laws when you have two contradictory commandments? So they came up with the doctrine of abrogation, which not many people know of. And the doctrine of abrogation basically says, yes, everything that's in the Quran is divine, and it was a revelation from God to Muhammad, but when there's a contradiction, the last word on the issue supersedes all the rest. And then the rest can apply if the believer finds himself in that circumstance, once again, like Muhammad did. So it just so happens that all the violent verses happen to be the last ones that were spoken.
That happens to trace Muhammad's life.
From Mecca to Medina.
Yes,
exactly.
The experiences
Right.
he was having.
Right.
Well, then what role do the hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, play in establishing these
Right.
kinds of laws?
Well, they supplement the Quran. For example, if the Quran, a lot of the stuff in the Quran is not is very ambiguous. I'm sure you know the Quran isn't a very clear-cut document. It's very flowery and poetic.
Yeah.
So the hadith oftentimes supplements it by actually clarifying. For example, in the Quran, it does not say pray 5 times. That was fixed from the hadith.
Right.
It was fixed from the Sunnah of Muhammad, his habits and his practices. But generally, the hadith now is much more comprehensive than the Quran. There are 6 canonical hadith collections, and these sometimes address so many other aspects that the Quran never talks about. And if the Quran doesn't talk about it and it's in one of the more authentic hadiths, then that becomes codified into Sharia law.
I had talked to an FBI agent who'd done a lot of interrogation, and he said that the Quran is really rarely cited by Al-Qaeda members that he's interrogated. It's hadith, and sometimes very selective hadith that they use to justify their actions. And if, I know in Yemen and even in Egypt right now that there are theological arguments going on between the state, represented by imams, and these qaidists, and trying to justify their actions through the Quran, which is very difficult to do.
Well, actually, and this is an important one, suicide bombing. We were talking about that.
Yes.
Going back to that point you were making about killing yourselves, and the Quran says don't kill yourself.
Yeah.
That one verse, what it literally says, it doesn't use the word kill. It says don't destroy yourself. And some of the exegetes throughout Islamic history have interpreted that as to not mean kill yourself physically, but don't destroy yourself by giving up jihad in order to make money for yourself.
Yes.
And there's good grounding for that.
Right.
Okay, now, it's up to the Muslim to decide which interpretation they think is fit.
But Bin Laden, he likes to cite that, but the hadith, the Prophet Muhammad said that the specific punishment for a suicide would be spend all of eternity in the act of killing himself with the same instrument he used to die. And when his favorite warrior was injured in battle and in great pain and put himself out of his misery, Muhammad said he will be in hell.
Right. Now that's a good point. Now, in Sharia law, we were talking about the Quran and the Hadith and the Sunnah, and that's where the scholars derive the laws. Now, another one, a third of the four sources of doing this is called in Arabic qiyas, which means analogy. So, if there's something in the Quran that doesn't, or there's some issue that's not addressed in the Quran, but there's something, a precedent or something similar to it, then you can use that. So, for example, wine is forbidden in the Quran. Does that mean I can't drink whiskey? So through analogy, they've determined that since wine is, so is that. Now, in this one document that Zawahiri directs or addresses about martyrdom and suicide operations, he uses this method, which, like I said, is a legitimate method in Islamic jurisprudence. And he basically shows through the hadith numerous mujahideen, Muslim fighters in the time of Muhammad, who knowingly hurl themselves literally, sometimes in catapults, against the enemy, knowing full well that they will die, and they die. And then, for example, there's another one where a man says, and he's talking to Muhammad, he says, and there's enemies there, he says, what happens if I go fight and die? Muhammad says, you will be in paradise. The man takes his sword, breaks it in half, goes and starts swinging till he dies. Okay? So now, through that, Zawahiri uses analogy and says, so the point isn't if you physically kill yourself or if you don't kill yourself. The point is, are you killing yourself to benefit the religion, jihad, in the path of Allah, or are you killing yourself out of despair and depression, which would be suicide and which would be forbidden?
I often think that we should. We'll take a little break here, and then we'll get back to this subject.
Sure.
Afterwards, and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcasts. More with Raymond Ibrahim and Lawrence Wright in a moment.
Next Sunday on Book TV, The Black Swan. Nassim Taleb argues that random and improbable events have a large effect on world history. From 9/11 to the success of Google, the author contends that these black swans, or extraordinary actions, challenge our concept of the unknown. He's interviewed by David Brooks, columnist for the New York Times. The Black Swan, next Sunday on Afterwards, 6 p.m. Eastern, only on Book TV.
Afterwards with Raymond Ibrahim and Lawrence Wright continues.
Point about suicide is really interesting to me because Zawahiri is the one who improvised this idea in Sunni Islam that you could have suicide martyrs beginning in 1993 when he tried to kill the Egyptian prime minister through the use of suicide bombers. He also improvised the use of martyrdom tapes. So he is the great inventor of the use of suicide in Sunni Islam. And I often think in traveling in that part of the world, there's so much despair, and suicide is so stigmatized in Islam that it's so surprising to me that this movement could take something so specifically forbidden and get away with it. I understand what you're saying about the quotations that he makes in early Islam, but still, the Hadith, the Quran, there's such specific prohibitions. It stuns me that Al-Qaeda is able to justify this.
Well, once again, what he does is, like we said, that analogy, which is a legitimate root of Islamic jurisprudence. And so he first he quotes about 10 pages of early Islamic warriors who just literally, knowing they're going to die, go and hurl themselves, die, and then they get praised, oftentimes by Muhammad. And so, again, you can see he's saying it's not if you kill yourself or if someone kills you, it's why you are killing yourself. Okay?
But they didn't actually go into battle in order to die. They went in fighting against unlikely odds.
No, well, exactly, but like one warrior would go in, like that one I quoted. He says, if I die, I'll go. So he almost breaks his sword so he can die faster.
This reminds me, I was in Pakistan. I was talking to this Pakistani journalist, Rahimullah Yusufzai, who came upon a group of Arab-Afghan fighters in the jihad against the Soviets, and they were camped outside in white tents on an open field. And he said, "What are you thinking? The Soviet Air Force could easily see you. They'll wipe you out." And one of the Arabs responded by saying, "But we came to die."
Exactly.
And if you talk to these jihadis, they will always tell you that it was death, not victory, that summoned them. To that extent.
And that's what leads to victory. And they often say that because of that sort of zeal that you're willing to die, not so many people can comprehend or attack that kind of thing.
It's very difficult to disentangle these motives. How much is it that someone wants to die, that Al-Qaeda offers them a meaningful death when their lives may not count for as much?
But it's not so much Al-Qaeda offers it. Al-Qaeda kind of articulates it by bringing the hadiths and the Quranic verses that would justify it. For example, and this is very interesting, and I don't know if anyone said this before, but I believe that the date 9/11 was picked because the one verse in all the Quran that does lend itself to suicide bombings, which states, and I can actually pull it out.
Yeah, it'd be interesting.
Yeah, it states, and it's in his jihad and the killing of innocent people. It's verse. This is interesting when you find out which verse it is. It says, quote, "Allah has bought from the believers their lives and worldly goods, and in return has promised them paradise. They shall fight in the way of Allah and shall slay and be slain." Now that's book 9, verse 111. Interesting parallel.
Yeah.
9/11, 2001.
Right.
It's often made me wonder, did they pick that date as a symbolic reference to this verse? Because this is the closest thing that comes to suicide bombing or justifying killing yourself. It says, flat out, they shall fight and kill and be killed.
Right.
Knowingly. So again, going back to this concept of analogy, basically Zawahiri and others are saying that, look, it doesn't matter if you stick the knife in yourself or not, while you're doing it. If you do it and you end up killing 3,000 people in Twin Towers, that's great, And
well, there was a parallel in early Islam with the Hashashin, and
the assassins.
The assassins. When they would go to kill a public figure in a crowd, they would slay him and then just stand there and wait to be beaten to death by the mob. That was their expected punishment.
Right. Now, and here's the thing that we have to all understand. We can make the arguments that, well, this is really not part of Islam, or this is being misinterpreted. And maybe it is. But the fact is that it can be misinterpreted. That there are Muslims who will do this is frightening enough, really. Because you can't see, have you seen, for example, and we were talking about how oppressed Muslims are around the world, and they are in very many areas. But the fact of the matter is, they're not the only people oppressed in this world. Okay? Have you seen a Buddhist, for example, driving an explosive-laden truck into the communist China government building saying, Free Tibet, Buddha's great.
There have been extremists in a
They
lot of
usually burn
different...
themselves.
Yes, but in the Tamil Tigers, who are really, until Iraq, the leading proponents of suicide
But
bombing.
did they ground it in a religion?
They have religious justifications behind their actions, and I think that in some respects that's mandatory when you're asking for someone to give up their lives, like the suicide bombers of Japan. You know, they believed in the divine emperor and so on. They really did believe that there was a religious motivation and justification behind their actions.
Well, yeah. Well, that's the thing. When a religion comes into play and it offers that sort of thing, see, that's why people need to differentiate between ideologies, which generally are man-made and recognized as man-made. Let's say something as Nazism, and a theology which maintains an ideological component. Because an ideology, man-made ideology, can always be discredited and just shown how it was wrong. And that's the end of it.
Right.
But in theology, as long as you, based on faith alone, are a follower of this religion, and it maintains or it says do this in black and white terms, no matter how ridiculous it may look, it's so hard to discredit it because the authority isn't Hitler or any other man. You know, the authority's God, and if God is saying it, then it's immutable. It transcends time and space. It's not something that applied only in the 7th century, but now we're trying to live a modern life.
Well, people are always complaining that moderate Muslims are not speaking up and countering that. From your research, do you feel like they are handicapped in that, or are they simply not making the case?
It's several factors, I think. One, of course, is that a lot of moderate Muslims probably agree or at least sympathize with this worldview, but they're not necessarily going to commit to it in the same way that Al-Qaeda would. You know, and they just want to kind of live and do their own thing. But they agree, and when they read the Quran, and the Quran says flat out, fight the infidels until, if they're sincere with themselves, how can they rationalize that away and say, well, you know, that doesn't apply anymore? Then there's others, of course, who probably, and I think a lot of Muslims around the world are like a lot of Christians and a lot of other people of faith. They just don't even know what their books say.
Right.
A lot of Muslims are content with the 5 pillars, which is great, you know, the praying and giving alms and fasting. And these particulars of Sharia law, they're not even aware of, you know.
Yeah, every religion has contradictions in it, like Judaism is, you know, if you read the Torah, much of Jewish law has to do with the temple, going to the temple. And of course, the temple was destroyed in the 1st century. And so there are many Jews who believe that Judaism can never be complete until the temple is restored. And they're not a majority, though.
Right.
But if you're a literalist, if you're a fundamentalist in the sense that I'm saying, then every effort must be made to restore that temple so that Judaism can be returned to its pure state. And very similar with some of the fundamentalist Christians who believe that
Coming of the Messiah.
yes, that we have to push the apocalypse and bring on the end of days.
Right.
And then, of course, Islam has its very notable characters that are pushing the same thing. They have, in many respects, the fundamentalists have more in common with each other than they do with members of their own
I agree
religion.
with that. But regarding that point, for example, about the Christians who have this, you know, agenda about trying to get Jerusalem all ready for the second coming, the thing about that, though, is there's no commandment in the New Testament telling them to do this. There's nothing like that. You see? Now, and that's what I mean. I'm trying to differentiate between what people do of whatever religion they follow and what the religion itself teaches. Now, have Christians done awful things? Of course. They've done some of the worst things. Now, does that mean that's what Christianity teaches? Now, I'm saying right now that Islam does teach a bit of violence and a bit of intolerance based on their own text, based on the words of the Hadith, based on the words of the most authoritative theologians. This isn't from my own, you know, I didn't come up with this. This is what they say. Now, does that mean Muslims will do it? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. So we have to always kind of keep a dividing line in our mind about the religions and the people. I can sit here and say Islam teaches X, Y, and Z. I can do that because Islam is a faith and it's objective, and you can sit there and talk about it and say Islam commands this, Islam prohibits this. I can do that with Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism or Hinduism. But I can't do that with the practitioners of these faiths because they, in their own way, can misinterpret it, they can ignore it, they can just not even know about it. So every time I talk, I try to, clearly distinguish between the faith and the people. The people are subjective. They're first and foremost human beings before they are Christians or Muslims or Jews. But the faith is something that, and that's why I don't like a lot of people who try to dissemble and make it sound like it's so hard and there's so many different interpretations. And especially in Islam, it's a very black and white worldview. Under Sharia law, every single act that you and I can commit in this life is classified as being either forbidden, disliked, shouldn't do, but it's okay, permissible, recommended, or obligatory. Every single act. Secular, I said this to someone earlier, they said even secular acts? Yes, that's the whole point, everything. So, and it's clear cut, it's been articulated in Sharia law, there's the precedents. So, now, is a Muslim going to necessarily follow that? It's up to him.
Right.
He can go and eat pork and, unless he's in the Middle East, and he'll probably get killed. But here he can do it. And
it's interesting about, more than any other faith, I think, Muslims are required to think about the ethical consequences of every action.
Right.
And there's something really beautiful about that. And yet there are contradictions within that. The violence that has been a plague in Islam from the moment that the Prophet died. The internal violence, I'm saying. Fitna, discord,
civil
in Arabic.
discord.
The split inside the Islamic community, the kind of Islamic civil war that rages actively or subterraneanly almost since its inception.
Right.
And the number of Muslims who are victims of the hands of Al-Qaeda right now, many times more than Americans died in 9/11.
Sure.
So those kinds of contradictions inside Islam are really at the heart of what has crippled the Muslim world, I think.
Right.
It's famously a religion that does not have a center of authority. And this can be wonderful. This can be beautiful, that each person is responsible for his own salvation, for his own relationship to God. Exactly. And yet, the absence of an authority makes it very difficult to talk to Islam.
Exactly.
Because
and
that anybody can, like Bin Laden, put it on himself to be the voice of the Muslim
But
people.
there is, and this is the fourth root of jurisprudence, and this is it's very important, which is called in Arabic ijma, which means consensus. The consensus of the ummah, or more realistically, of the scholars. Yeah. So whenever, and it usually translates into the consensus of the Islamic theologians, because they're the ones who have a lot of weight in these issues. So a lot of the things, for example, that whole concept of the abode of war and the abode of Islam, it's not something Bin Laden came up with. That's something that was fixed with total consensus from all of the scholars, and it was the natural worldview. And see, we can now sit and say, well, that was necessary because it was back then, everyone was hostile, you had to protect yourself, everyone was trying to... But to a Muslim, you really can't do that because it's not that they fixed it. They have studied, and through exegesis of all the sources, the Hadith and the Quran, they've come up with, or all those sources have led them to conclude that this has to be the way it is. And since it's based on the divine sources, the Quran and the Sunnah, then it has to apply always. In other words, to say that the abode of Islam and the abode of war is kind of outmoded is the same as to come and tell a Muslim not eating pork is outmoded. Because now we know swine isn't as bad as we thought, so why don't you start eating pork? Their answer will be because it commands me not to. So it's the same thing with this dichotomy of abode of war and abode of Islam that has to be at war. It's commanded. It doesn't matter. And, there's a verse, for example, that says, fighting is prescribed for you, fighting to spread Islam, though you may dislike it.
Right.
And God knows what's in your interest.
But for centuries, Muslims have been able to negotiate a way of living in peace with their neighbors and not at war with themselves. And so, what is the difference now?
The difference now
between
now and then?
If this is an eternal state of
Right.
affairs in Islam, why is it now that we're seeing this violence justified by the Quran? Why haven't Muslims always been?
They always have. Ever since the 7th century, until the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which was the final authority, sultanate of the Islamic world, jihad was always expanding. Let's not forget, jihad not only took over Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, apostasy wars, which were extremely bloody. Thousands, tens of thousands of Arabs, after Muhammad died, broke away from Islam. And Abu Bakr, the second caliph, they went into major wars, killed them all, and then consolidated Arabia. Then it spread west and east. It spread all through North Africa, Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, into Spain, into France, that was beaten at the Battle of Tours, all by the sword.
Small historical coincidence that the date that Islam stopped its expansion was September 11th, 1683.
Well, see, that's what I've always been told was why September 9/11 was
picked. Oh,
picked.
no, it doesn't have anything to do with the Islamic calendar.
Right.
You know, it wouldn't correlate. But I think it's fascinating to think that the King of Poland arrived to break the Ottoman siege of the gates of Vienna.
Right.
And that was the furthest extension of Muslim armies into Europe. Right. And since then, it's been in this long retreat.
Well, that was the first wave, what I just spoke, which is all the way to France and then all the way basically to India. Then you get another wave where the Mongols came and then they converted to Islam. And whether they do it for cynical reasons or not, they continued the expansion, but then they started calling it a jihad. And that's when Russia was, came under the Tartar yoke. That's when the Balkans were taken over with the Ottomans. So it was always like that until Islam became weak. So now in the modern era, the West is much more powerful, technologically at least, militaristically and economically. So that's why you're not seeing Muslims en masse invading in an offensive jihad. It's not because they've disavowed it and said this is obsolete. It's because they literally cannot do it, except in areas like Sudan and Darfur, because they're on the same footing.
I often think of, you think about the old Islamic Caliphate in Al-Andalus in Spain. And if you've ever visited there, you're brought to your knees by the beauty of the place, the culture that was so tolerant, and it was a repository for all the translations, the math, everything that we. They were preserved because of the Muslims there, and Bin Laden and Zawahiri occasionally invoke Al-Andalus, the lost Al-Andalus.
Well, to them, Al-Andalus is no less occupied territory than Palestine.
Exactly.
Because it was part of the Ummah, and if it was part of the Ummah once, it's always part of the Ummah. So
but I often reflect that if they were standing for a government, a society that was as open and tolerant and progressive, and which worshipped beauty and poetry and learning as they did in Al-Andalus, who would stand against them? But tragically, it was other Muslims that fought against the caliph there and weakened them, and it was really that caused the Catholic Spain to eventually expel the Muslims and the Jews.
Which we should not also forget, that the Muslims came there by force in the first place.
Yeah.
A lot of people tell me, well, look at what the Catholics did to the Muslims. They kicked them out. Well, the Muslims took it by force in the first place. And the same thing with the Crusades. Look at the horrible Crusaders. They went and killed the Muslims. Well, the Muslims came and killed the Christians when it was part of the Byzantine Empire. But I would not want anything, what I'm saying here, to be misconstrued as I'm saying Islam is totally, a bad thing. I think, like you're saying, it has many great aspects. The high civilization in the Middle Ages, its contributions. It's big on giving charity, and the prayers and the fasting. I think all that's great. What I'm talking about, though, are very few particular doctrines that affect the other, us, the non-Muslim. And so, when you're talking about Spain, for example, or a lot of people say the Jews ran to Ottoman Turkey because it was much better for them. That may well be true, but the fact is, under Islamic law then and today, a Jew or a Christian would have to live as a second-class citizen. Period. Okay? A Christian's testimony in court would not be taken vis-a-vis a Muslim, for example. In certain periods, they were extremely handicapped, and they had to ride only donkeys. You can't ride a horse. You can't build a new church. Only the old ones maybe you can fix sometimes, and this is still going on in Egypt with the crowds. All kinds of, and a lot of them, and the jurists say, all of these debilitations are meant simply to induce humiliation in accordance to verse 929. So it's basically the whole concept of offensive jihad, which must go on when Muslims can do it, can undertake it militarily until the world is governed according to Islamic law, and the concept that those who do not want to convert, the Dhimmis, the Christians and the Jews, have to live as second-class citizens. These are the problematic issues with Islam. The rest of it, like you were saying, it has a great history, you know, it had made many contributions, but these two issues are very pivotal to our understanding and our discourse with them.
I think the word humiliation, which you just brought up, is one of the most common words in Bin Laden's vocabulary, at least. And I often wonder about his use of the term. Now, you take the case of Zawahiri, he was humiliated. He was tortured in prison. You know, and that's been the case of many of these Islamist radicals, and I think it accounts for the peculiar appetite for carnage that's so characteristic of Al-Qaeda and separates it from any other terrorist group. But Bin Laden was rich.
Playboy.
Well, he was never a playboy.
Right.
He was always pious.
I heard different things. I hear he used to go and hang out in Lebanon.
No,
Then I heard...
No, he was from an early teenage, he was always very, very pious.
Okay.
And so he never had the playboy stage that was part of the mythology about him early on. But nor was he ever physically humiliated the way that Zawahiri was. And yet he invokes this word again and again, and it resonates with many.
Well, he's talking, I think, in general about the Muslim world being humiliated.
Yes.
You know.
That it's been in retreat.
Right.
That there was once only one great empire, one great superpower.
Exactly.
And it was Islam.
And we have to go back to it. And
Yes.
we're even in the book, there's quotations that say basically, and it's hadiths that of Muhammad saying that if you forfeit jihad and hold on to the tails of cows and attend to your merchandise and trade, in other words, if you give up jihad, humiliation will overtake you until you return to your original position of jihad. He evokes that many times.
Yeah, I saw a videotape of him speaking in the Bin Laden family mosque in Mecca, in Jeddah, right after he returned from the jihad and in Afghanistan. And he was saying, you know, that if you give up your jihad and turn to money, God will send you a great humiliation. And this was what he was, you know, he charges the Muslims with. You have brought this on yourselves because you turned away from God's commandments.
That's exactly how, not just to him, but a lot of the radicals, quote unquote, that's their whole thing. That's why they're trying to awaken the Ummah. Basically, you've lost your position of supremacy on the world because you forfeited jihad and you become lazy. Going back to the verse, fighting is prescribed for you, even if you dislike it. God knows what's best for you.
I'm fascinated by this movement that's going on right now in the Egyptian prisons, where members of the former leaders of Gamaz, Lamea, and Al-Jihad, which was Zawahiri's organization, have recanted their views, and they are religious justifications for their change in perspective. That they attack, for instance, martyrdom, suicide operations as being un-Islamic. They attack the killing of others, you know, who are non-combatants. All of these things are very clearly prescribed by Islam, but have been excused by or justified by Al-Qaeda, and now these prisoners, and it may be because they're prisoners, have issued some very interesting recantations that are being studied quite interestingly, I think, in a lot of them by Egyptians and other people in that part of the world.
Well, 2 points. First is, you're right. I mean, there's different, you can, as a Muslim, come up with a different interpretation. Now, how is it as well-grounded as another interpretation? That's up to the individual. But that's the point right there, that in Islam, people can even come up with these violent interpretations because they're there, because of those many verses and those many hadiths and Sharia's laws, you know. So we can say even, let's say a whole lot of Muslims will ignore it or reinterpret it in a modern sense. That doesn't change the fact that some will always take it literally. It literally says in the Quran, when you meet infidels, chop their heads off, like that Abu Musab Zarqawi used to do. It says in the Quran, it is not right for a prophet to make peace until he has caused slaughter in the land. Okay? And so, but the point is, there will always be some, and that's the problem. It took 19 to cause 9/11. We don't need an entire 1.2 billion ummah to do this, but as long as there's a handful, And considering the nature of the war that we're in, where it's not numbers that make a difference, thanks to technology, you know. And so it's ultimately, sure, let's say most Muslims don't agree with it. Some will always, and that's the problem. And the second point, you were talking about the killing of innocents and how that's obviously, you know, un-Islamic. Not so, Ayman Zawahiri would argue in that treatise. And he, again, does it through legitimate Islamic jurisprudence. For example, when it comes to the prohibition against killing women and children, which Muhammad did say, don't kill women and children. There's an incident, though, and it's recorded in the biographies and in the hadith, where when Muhammad was laying siege to the town of Taif, he used catapults.
Right.
And so the jurists have concluded that, well, a catapult doesn't distinguish between women and children and men. It'll kill them all.
And
so
Al-Qaeda uses that to comparing airplanes to the catapult.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. It's the catapult thing has actually, in fact, been used by other scholars, Islamic radical scholars, to justify weapons of mass destruction because they kill indiscriminately. And the other hadith, a mujahid fighter came to Muhammad and said, "Is it okay to attack, this town or village at night and set fire to the fortifications, knowing that there are women and children in there?" And Muhammad's terse reply was simply, "They, women and children, are from among them, infidels." And these are sahih, authentic hadith. So, and then Zawahiri brings up another interesting point. Based on this, he says, when these two incidences occurred using the catapults and lighting fire, and in both incidences Muhammad approved, that was during an offensive jihad. In other words, that was when Muhammad and the Muslims were invading people just to spread Islam.
Yeah.
So the logic, he concludes, if it's a defensive jihad, where according to someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, a very revered Islamic theologian, that is second to faith. And in a defensive jihad, surely we can do this stuff if they could have done it in an offensive jihad.
This has been a really interesting conversation,
Thanks.
and I wish you luck with this book, and I think it's really important for all of us to study, what our enemy actually says.
Right, and the one thing we should not do is to apply our worldview on other people. In other words, I think we live in a very secular worldview, and even the religious elements, let's say, and the majority of people in America would be Christian, they have this subconscious idea that religion is totally separated from the sphere of politics in the world. Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, unto God what is God's," spiritual and material. So we should not make the mistake of applying that worldview to the Muslim world, because in Islam it's extremely different. It's a very legalistic religion. It's not so much spiritual, unless you're a Sufi, and they make up 2% of the Muslim world. But it's very much caught up in the now and what you do. It's very legalistic. It's sort of like Judaism in that sense, traditional Judaism. So we shouldn't discount what they say and say, oh, they're just, using some kind of theology to just make a